He was the quiet genius of the desert. The guy who could take a pile of junk, a rusted-out carcass of a car that most people would have dragged straight to the scrapyard, and turn it into something that belonged in a museum. Ian Roussel of Full Custom Garage wasn't just a builder, he was a walking, welding, metal-bending legend. So when he suddenly vanished from your TV screen, you had to wonder, what on earth happened to him? The man who never cared about the camera. Before we get into the collapse, the grief, and everything that followed, and we are absolutely getting there, you need to understand who Ian Roussel actually is. Not the television version. The real one. Ian Roussel grew up in Southern California and, from an early age, it was obvious school was never going to be his arena. He was the kid whose talents showed up in a garage, not a classroom. He didn't follow a conventional path into the craft, no trade school, no formal apprenticeship. What he did was start building things, and keep building things, until the quality of what he made spoke loudly enough that other people started paying attention. By his early 20s he had launched his own custom car operation in the Mojave Desert, building the same way he built every car, alone, without a blueprint, working entirely from the vision in his head. The work was already strange and remarkable before television ever found him. Not strange as in gimmicky, strange as in it didn't look like anyone else's work. Ian wasn't interested in replicating styles or chasing what was fashionable. He was interested in form. In shape. In what happens when you strip expectations from a piece of metal and let it become whatever it needs to be. He explained it once with brutal clarity, I'm not particularly into cars. It's my addiction, making them, creating all of these shapes. Not car enthusiasm. Not gearhead love. Addiction to the act of making. That single sentence explains everything about why his work looked the way it did, and why watching him work felt different from watching anyone else on television. The music playing while he worked was Ministry and the Dead Milkmen. He described himself, without embarrassment, as kind of a punk rock guy. He had no interest in softening his aesthetic for a mainstream audience. He was who he was, and that uncompromising specificity was exactly what made him fascinating. He wasn't entirely alone in the desert, though. His wife Jamie was his essential partner, managing operations, handling client communications, and over time becoming central to production and editing. Where Ian built, Jamie ran the business that made the building possible. That quiet partnership was structural. Everything Ian Roussel created publicly ran through the infrastructure they built together. By the time MAVTV came calling, Ian had spent 2 decades becoming genuinely excellent at something most people couldn't fully describe. Which made him, as television quickly realized, perfect for the screen. But here's what nobody stops to ask, what does it actually cost someone like that, a man whose entire identity was built on absolute authenticity, when you put him on camera and ask him to do it again for the B-roll? And what happens to a body working those hours in that heat, year after year, before the bill finally comes due? 9 seasons and the thing they couldn't show. Full Custom Garage premiered on MAVTV Motorsports Network on March 28, 2014. From the moment it aired, it was clear this was something genuinely different. In 2014, car television was full of countdown clocks and manufactured crises. Clients storming in with unreasonable demands. Builders storming back with dramatic ultimatums. Enormous production teams edited to look like scrappy underdogs. The drama was industrial, the formula rigid, and audiences had been trained to expect it on schedule. Ian Roussel showed up and did none of that. He worked alone, no crew, no apprentices, no supporting cast engineered for tension. No blueprints, no computer renderings, no design software. He'd look at a car, let an approach form in his mind, and start cutting. He narrated his process in real time, quietly, while punk rock played in the background. He made mistakes and didn't hide them. He changed direction mid-build when the material demanded it, explaining why on camera as if there were nothing unusual about it. The result was a show that felt less like entertainment and more like watching a craftsman at work, which, against all conventional wisdom about what makes good television, turned out to be extraordinary television. Full Custom Garage holds a remarkable 8.7 out of 10 on IMDb. 9 seasons. An audience that described the show not as something they watched but something they studied. Fans drove hours to the Mojave just to stand outside the shop. They rewound build sequences to understand how Ian achieved a specific curve. International buyers, collectors in Japan, Germany, the Netherlands, commissioned vehicles sight unseen. Jamie's role expanded steadily alongside all of it: operations, client management, production coordination, editing. The show looked like one man alone. The enterprise behind it was a partnership. But here's what the camera never adequately communicated: the physical reality of the conditions. The Mojave Desert Workshop was not air-conditioned. Desert summers regularly exceed 110 degrees Fahrenheit, and that's before you add welding heat, grinding metal, and a corrugated metal building absorbing sun all day. Ian Roussel was in those conditions for 13-hour days, filming a television show. Not occasionally. Consistently. For years. The human body can compensate for extreme heat, but not indefinitely. It degrades. It has a capacity, and when that capacity is exceeded repeatedly over years, the body starts failing in ways that can't be negotiated with. Nobody watching Full Custom Garage from their couch could see any of that. They saw magnificent work in beautiful desert light. They didn't see the cost. So what happens when the bill finally arrives? When years of 13-hour days in heat that has no business being endured become something a body simply cannot push through anymore? What does that look like for a man who has never once been willing to stop? The collapse, what the Mojave finally took. Around late 2022 into early 2023, Ian Roussel's body stopped compensating. He's spoken about this publicly, not for sympathy, not for drama, but with the same matter-of-fact directness he brings to everything. He suffered a serious heat-related collapse. The symptoms were consistent with heat stroke, and the physical consequences included minor kidney damage. His kidneys, already under chronic stress from years of extreme desert heat, had been pushed past the point of recovery. This was not a man who got too warm and needed to sit down. This was organ damage. This was the Mojave presenting Ian Roussel with the medical bill for everything he had borrowed from his own body, with years of compounded interest. For a man whose identity was built entirely around the ability to endure, to push through, to keep going no matter what, this reckoning went well beyond the physical. And it didn't arrive alone. On May 5, 2022, Dude died. If you watched Full Custom Garage at all, you knew Dude. The dog was embedded in the DNA of the show, wandering through the frame during builds, observing Ian's process with what viewers like to imagine was professional scrutiny, making the whole thing feel warmer and more real than most television ever manages. MAVTV's own social media affectionately called him one of their favorite personalities. He wasn't a prop or a marketing decision. He was just there, the same way the metal was there and the punk rock was there. Dude died of cancer in May 2022. Ian posted about it. The fan response was immediate and collective: comments, tributes, shared memories, and it showed exactly how personally people had connected with this show. They weren't mourning a television animal. They were mourning something they felt they had shared space with for years. So here is the timeline laid plain. May 2022, Dude dies. Late 2022 into early 2023, Ian suffers a heat stroke that damages his kidneys. 13-hour days in extreme heat, 9 seasons, for a show whose production demands were fundamentally at odds with how Ian actually worked. Something had to give. And it did. The question is, how does a man like Ian Roussel process all of that at once? Does he fall apart publicly? Does he rage against the machine? Or does he do something far more interesting? Walking, and building the door before he needed it. Here's the thing the headlines bury: Ian Roussel was not cancelled. He was not fired. He was not eased out by network executives who'd moved on. He chose to leave, on his own schedule, on his own terms, and he'd been quietly preparing to do so for longer than anyone realized. By late 2023, Ian made the call. He was done with television. The final episodes of Full Custom Garage aired in January 2024, a clean, dignified conclusion to 9 seasons, with no public acrimony, no dramatic statement, no burned bridges. Just a craftsman finishing what he started and putting it down. Now here's the detail that changes the entire narrative. Full Custom Ian, and Jamie's YouTube channel, launched on January 29, 2023. Months before his final television episodes aired. Before any public announcement that the show was ending. Ian Roussel had already built the door. He walked through it when he was ready. The philosophy behind the YouTube channel was the direct inverse of everything that had worn him down. Episode lengths followed the actual pace of the work, anywhere from 18 minutes to over an hour, depending on what a build genuinely required, not what a broadcast schedule demanded. No artificial suspense. No retakes. If Ian made a mistake, it stayed in. If he had to rethink an approach mid-build, you saw the whole rethink, the confusion, the recalculation, the solution emerging in real time. That's not a flaw in the format. That is the format. The thing television had been trimming out for 9 years. Jamie stepped fully into the production role she had been growing toward, editing, producing, shaping the raw footage with the same directness Ian brought to the metal. The output was substantial. The audience found them immediately, because what they were getting was the unmediated version of Ian Roussel, the one that had always existed behind the television packaging. Comment sections filled with notes from people who'd been following since 2014, describing it as finally getting to meet the real man. The Instagram account at @full_custom_Ian grew past 172,000 followers. He appeared at SEMA 2023 alongside Jamie, presenting new work and signing autographed posters, not as a celebrity making a promotional appearance, but as a craftsman showing what he'd been building. There's a difference, and Ian has always understood it better than anyone. But just when the new chapter was clicking into place, the platform growing, the creative freedom restored, the universe had one more loss lined up. And this one hit differently, because it wasn't a health scare or a career pivot. It was the physical ground where everything had happened. The closing of the Desert Ranch. In September 2024, Ian and Jamie Roussel closed the Desert Ranch shop. The shop had been Ian's Mojave Desert workshop for years, the place where the show was filmed, where hundreds of vehicles were built, where dude used to wander between the welding rigs, where fans had made pilgrimages from across the country just to stand outside and feel connected to something they cared about. When the closure was announced, social media responded in a way that showed exactly how much the place had meant to people beyond its walls. Fans posted photos from visits years old alongside memories of what watching someone build extraordinary things in that specific space had done for how they thought about craftsmanship, about creative commitment, about what's possible with skilled hands and uncompromising vision. Custom builders posted about how seeing Ian work there had changed their understanding of their own work. Ian handled it the way he handles everything, with direct, unperformative honesty. The chapter was finished. Holding on to the building after the chapter ended would have been holding on for the wrong reasons. The work would continue. But it's worth sitting with what was actually closed. Not a building. Not a business address. The Desert Ranch was the physical embodiment of a philosophy, the idea that one person, in a simple space, working alone, could make things of lasting value and beauty. That philosophy doesn't close when a building does. But the specific place where it was practiced. That's a real and specific loss. The fans who mourned it weren't being sentimental. They were responding to something that genuinely mattered. So after the grief, the health crisis, the end of the TV era, and the closing of the legendary shop, where does Ian Roussel actually stand? And is there anything left worth watching? What is building now, and the legacy that outlasts all of it? Here's what all the tragedy framing in the headlines is designed to make you miss. Ian Roussel is still working. Actively, prolifically, and by every observable measure more freely than he has been in years. The full Custom Ian YouTube channel is thriving. He's in a new shop, unburdened by accumulated mythology, building at a pace that would exhaust craftsmen half his age. The 1949 Metro van project, a vehicle Ian originally built that has come back into his hands, is being prepared for SEMA 2025. Think about that, a build from his past, returned to him, being remade for a new chapter. Ian would roll his eyes at anyone pointing out the symbolism, then go back to cutting metal. There's also a 1968 Volkswagen with custom lighting referencing Porsche 917 design language. Rat rods built from salvaged industrial equipment. The scope of the work hasn't narrowed, it's wider, freed from the episodic structure that once required each build to resolve neatly within a television runtime. People who watch the YouTube content describe his on-camera presence as noticeably lighter. More spacious. More willing to linger in the thinking parts of a build, the standing back, the waiting, the moment when the work tells you what it needs next. Those moments almost never made the television edit. They're everywhere now. As for the legacy, when the history of custom car television gets written properly, Ian Roussel will sit in a specific and irreplaceable place in it. He will be the proof of concept. The evidence that you could make 9 seasons of critically beloved automotive television with one person, alone, in the desert, with no manufactured drama, and rate 8.7 on IMDb, build an international following, and have your work shipped to collectors in Japan, Germany, and the Netherlands. That is not a footnote. That's an argument about what television could be if it trusted its subjects more than its formats. The custom fabricators who point to full custom garage as the thing that made them believe the craft was worth pursuing. The young people who watched Ian work and understood, maybe for the first time, what it looked like when someone had found the precise right thing to do with their hands and their mind. That cultural weight doesn't show up in ratings data, but it's real, and it will outlast any of the losses in this story. The heat collapse scared people. Dude's death broke a piece of the community's heart. The desert ranch closing felt like a door shutting on something they hadn't known they were counting on. Every piece of that loss was real. But Ian Roussel is in a workshop right now. There's possibly punk rock playing. He's looking at a piece of metal and deciding what it's going to become. And nobody, no network, no production schedule, no broadcast window, gets to tell him when he has to stop. That's not a tragedy. That's the whole point. OUTRO. So let's call this what it is. The tragedy of Ian Roussel from Full Custom Garage isn't one dramatic event, it's an accumulation. Years of 13-hour days in heat that no reasonable production should have sustained, until his body sent him a message in the language of organ damage. The death of Dude on May 5, 2022, a loss genuinely felt across an entire fan community. 9 seasons of performing a version of himself that was always slightly smaller than the real thing. And the quiet grief of the desert ranch closing in September 2024, all those years of work packed into its walls. But here is what also happened. A man who never cared about performing quietly built his own stage before the network stage collapsed. Launched a YouTube channel in January 2023, before anyone outside his household knew the television era was ending. Walked away with dignity instead of drama. And is still there, in a new shop, building things that have no business being as beautiful as they are. He told a reporter, "I love what I do. The funny thing is that I'm not particularly into cars, but it's my addiction making them and creating all of these shapes." That addiction is still running. Everything else was just the price of admission. Head to Full Custom Ian on YouTube. Watch a full build, don't skip anything. You'll understand within 15 minutes why people drove to the Mojave just to stand outside his shop. Been watching since 2014? Drop your favorite build in the comments, we read every one. Like and subscribe. See you next time.